I never thought I'd stand on this porch again, staring at the same faded wreath that hung here 5 years ago, its berries cracked and peeling under the cold. Snow drifted around my boots, in soft spirals, settling on the welcome mat that had never welcomed me. Inside laughter floated through the windows, thin, rehearsed, and painfully familiar. For 5 Christmases, I sat alone in my apartment watching the world celebrate while my phone stayed dark, not a single Merry Christmas from the people who raised me. To them, I had stopped existing the moment I left this house. And yet the second Forbes published that article, the young woman behind a $50 million empire, my mother's honeyed voice appeared on my voicemail, calling me their family's pride, pretending the 5 years of silence had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Now here I was, standing in the glow of their porch light, the cold biting my fingers as I gripped the door handle. Inside, I could hear clinking glasses and chairs sliding across hardwood as if they were setting the stage for a performance. They had no idea what I carried with me: 5 years of estranged family memories, 5 years of family drama, 5 years of being an abandoned daughter learning how to build a life without them. I wasn't here for forgiveness. I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here for truth. And with one sentence, one that had been echoing in my mind since the day they cut me off, this entire house would fall silent. But before I could face them, I had to face the girl I used to be. I remember the first time I realized Christmas in our house wasn't about joy. I was 8, maybe 9, standing in the living room of our old Maplewood home while my mother adjusted the lights on the tree. She always dressed it like she dressed everything else in our lives, perfectly, meticulously, obsessively. If one ornament hung slightly crooked, she yanked it off and replaced the whole branch. She called it creating a picture-perfect holiday. I later learned it was the beginning of the family performance she curated every year, meant to convince neighbors that our family was flawless. I wasn't part of that performance, not really. Not once did she ask me where I wanted the angel topper or how I wanted the candy canes arranged. Instead, she used those moments to show me and everyone else how imperfect I was. "Stand straighter," she would hiss, as her friends gathered around the fireplace. "Stop fidgeting, smile properly." If I said the wrong thing or spoke too softly or touched the wrong decoration, she corrected me immediately, loud enough for every adult in the room to hear. It wasn't anger. It was humiliation masked as guidance, a polished form of public shaming that felt like a cold hand around my throat. My brother Mason never faced that. He could run through the house, break ornaments, spill cocoa all over the carpet, and still end up with a kiss on the forehead, and a "boys will be boys" from our mother. He was the pride of the family, the golden child, the one she held up as proof that she had done something right. With him, she was warm. With me, she was ice. Looking back, I think she saw me as the crack in her perfect image, the daughter who didn't fit the narrative she wanted to show the world. A problem to be managed. There was a Christmas when I was 10 that plays in my mind like a movie scene I can never turn off. There had been a small gift under the tree with my name on it, a rectangular package wrapped in gold paper. I remember touching it every day leading up to Christmas Eve, imagining what it might be. But when we gathered around the tree that night, the gift was gone. My mother shrugged when I asked. My father looked away. Mason smirked into his hot chocolate. I tried not to cry, telling myself maybe I had imagined it, maybe I was wrong. That was the beginning of me doubting my own memory, doubting my own voice. Years of gaslighting don't start with yelling. They start with moments like that, tiny fractures that turn into fault lines. As I grew older, the gaslighting became more precise. "You're too sensitive," she'd say whenever I flinched at her criticism. "You're remembering it wrong," if I ever tried to defend myself. She even convinced my father that my reactions were exaggerated, that I made up stories to get attention. And because he was too quiet, too afraid to challenge her, he believed her. Or he pretended to. The attic was my first clue that something was truly wrong in our family. I was 12 when I found the cedar chest, dark wood brass lock tucked behind boxes of Christmas ornaments. I remember lifting the lid just a crack and seeing hospital envelopes, the edges yellowed with age. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they were important. I barely had time to read the top of the first paper before my mother appeared in the doorway. She snapped the lid shut, grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks, and ordered me downstairs. "Curiosity ruins girls," she whispered. I didn't understand it then, but now, standing on her porch 5 years after she erased me from her life, I know that chest held the truth she spent decades burying. When I was 16, after another humiliating Christmas dinner filled with comparisons to Mason and snide remarks disguised as jokes, my father came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed and whispered, "One day the truth will find you." Then he left without another word. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged that something in our house was deeply wrong, and the last time he tried to protect me. By the time I was 21, the fractures in our family had deepened beyond repair. I had moved out, found a studio apartment in Columbus, and was working nights at a diner to pay for community college classes. That Christmas was the first one where I waited for a call that never came. I sat on the cold floor of my apartment, holding my phone, willing it to ring. Midnight passed. Christmas morning came, but nothing. No message, no apology, no love. That was the year I realized silence could be a weapon. Their silence cut deeper than any insult they'd ever thrown at me. And that was the Christmas I knew they had abandoned me fully and completely. I built myself from that silence. Every night shift, every class, every journal entry, every small digital workbook I created for people healing from trauma, every dollar I saved, every tear I hid. All of it built the foundation of what would one day be a $50 million company. Not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted a life where my worth wasn't determined by someone else's broken expectations. I'm not the girl who begged for her mother's approval anymore. I'm not the daughter who stayed quiet to avoid becoming the center of family drama. I'm not the abandoned child sitting in an empty apartment hoping for a call that would never come. I'm the woman who returned on her own terms, the woman they ignored until it benefited them not to. The woman standing on this porch with the truth in her hands. I exhaled into the cold air, my breath forming a thin cloud in front of me. The laughter inside grew louder, but it didn't shake me anymore. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and gripped the doorknob. It was time. Time for them to see the daughter they discarded. Time for them to hear the truth they buried. Time for them to understand that I didn't come home to belong. I came home to speak. The house always looked softer in my memories than it truly was. Back then, I convinced myself that the smell of cinnamon candles and lemon furniture polish meant warmth, that the carefully arranged wreaths and matching stockings meant love. I didn't have the language to understand that a house could look perfect while feeling hollow. I only knew that the closer Christmas came each year, the more tightly my mother wound herself, and the more carefully I learned to move through the rooms, trying not to trigger whatever version of her I'd be facing that day. When I was 8, Christmas Eve felt like a stage production. My mother's voice would echo down the hallway as she arranged garlands on the staircase, ordering me to stand straighter, smile wider, try harder. "People are watching," she'd warn as she tugged a brush through my hair. "We can't have you looking sloppy." She said it with the same tone people use to warn a child about touching a hot stove, like she was protecting me, when really she was protecting only herself. The neighbors would arrive with homemade cookies and loud laughter, calling our house so festive, never noticing how my mother's eyes darted everywhere, tracking my posture, my expressions, even how I held my glass of lemonade. The public humiliation always came dressed as motherly concern. If I stumbled over a word, she would chuckle, "Oh, Elena gets so nervous around people." If I accidentally used the wrong fork during dinner, she'd correct me in front of everyone, with a gentle hand on my shoulder and a sharp whisper in my ear. I learned early that being less noticeable meant being less of a problem. Mason, meanwhile, could spill gravy on the tablecloth, run through the living room with muddy shoes, or break a snow globe, and she'd laugh like it was charming. She told him he was spirited. She told me I was difficult. With every Christmas, the line between motherly affection and emotional discipline blurred further. I tried to ignore the tightening in my chest, the dread that built each year as the decorations came down from the attic. I tried to believe the story she told me, that I was too sensitive, that I misremembered things, that Mason didn't get more love, he just needed more attention. Gaslighting doesn't feel like abuse when you're a child. It feels like confusion. It feels like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. The attic was where the puzzle first became terrifying. I was 12 when I found that cedar chest. My mother had asked me to fetch the Christmas linens from upstairs. The attic was cold, always cold, the kind of cold that makes you feel watched even when you're alone. The bulb flickered overhead as I pushed boxes aside, trying to find the red and green storage bin she wanted. That's when I saw the chest, dark wood brass hinges, the carved lid gleaming faintly under the dim light. It wasn't locked that day. I only meant to peek inside to satisfy a small, innocent curiosity. But the moment I lifted the lid, the air around me shifted like the house itself held its breath. Inside were hospital envelopes, legal papers, and what looked like a birth certificate. My birth certificate. Except something was off: the handwriting, the signatures, the dates. I didn't understand what any of it meant, but I knew it shouldn't be hidden up there like contraband. I didn't get a chance to examine it. My mother appeared in the doorway with a face carved out of stone, eyes sharp and cold. She didn't shout. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she walked calmly across the room, closed the chest with a quiet but deliberate snap, and wrapped her fingers around my wrist. "Curiosity ruins girls," she whispered, breath hot against my cheek. "Stay out of things that don't belong to you." I wanted to ask why my own birth certificate didn't belong to me, but the words died in my throat when she tightened her grip. After that, I never went into the attic alone again. Between 12 and 17, my mother perfected her emotional craft. She rewrote memories so convincingly that I began to doubt my own mind. If I reminded her of something she'd said, she'd respond, "You always twist things." If I reacted to her criticism, she'd sigh, "Why do you make everything so dramatic?" If I cried, she'd accuse me of manipulation, even though she was the one pulling every string. My father, caught in the crossfire, learned to disappear. He buried himself in work, in football games, in anything that allowed him to avoid choosing sides. When she snapped at me during dinner, he kept his eyes fixed on his plate. When I asked for help with homework and she claimed I was lying for attention, he said nothing. Silence became his shield and my prison. I realized years later that he loved peace more than he loved truth. One Christmas, when I was 16, after a particularly brutal dinner where my mother made a joke about me never being quite right, I found my father standing in my doorway. He looked like a shadow of himself. Pale shoulders, hunched guilt hanging around him like smoke. He sat beside me and whispered, "Don't take what your mother says too seriously. One day the truth will find you." I wanted to ask what truth. I wanted him to stay. Instead, he patted my knee, stood up, and walked out before I could speak. His warning felt like a door that opened and closed too quickly to glimpse what was inside. By the time I turned 17, I had learned to stay quiet at Christmas. The more silent I was, the less she had to correct. The less visible I became, the less pain there was. I faded myself out of family photos by stepping just a little too far to the side, volunteering to take the picture, pretending I didn't care. I watched the dynamic unfold like a ritual, Mason radiant, and adored my mother glowing with pride, my father sitting with a tired smile that never reached his eyes, and me somewhere in the background, always out of focus. Years later, when I looked back at those photos, I saw it clearly. I wasn't part of the family narrative. I was the cautionary tale, the shadow, the part of the story my mother tried to edit out. My last Christmas at home was the quietest of them all. I remember standing in the kitchen washing dishes while they laughed in the living room. They didn't notice when I slipped on my coat or when I walked out into the snow. They didn't notice when I left the house entirely. It would be 5 years before they heard my voice again. Now, as I stood on their porch as an adult, a successful woman, a CEO, someone who had built a $50 million empire without a single word of encouragement from them, I felt the weight of all those lost Christmases pressing against my ribs. But the pain was different now. Not sharp like it used to be, not suffocating. It was a memory, nothing more. The version of me who once begged for their approval was gone. The girl they ignored was gone. The young woman whose voice they tried to bury had learned how to speak loudly enough for the world to hear. Inside the house, someone laughed, a shrill, familiar sound that used to split me open. Now it barely grazed my skin. I lifted my hand to knock, not as the child they trained to shrink, but as the woman who returned by choice. This time I wasn't walking into a home. I was walking into the truth. The year I turned 21 winter felt sharper than usual, like the cold itself was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I was living in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where the heat rattled through metal vents and the walls smelled faintly of detergent. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was the first space I had ever lived in where nobody corrected the way I sat, the way I spoke, or the way I smiled. Silence there wasn't a punishment. It was freedom. I was juggling 2 part-time jobs, one at a diner, one shelving books at the campus library, and taking classes whenever I could afford them. Psychology, business writing. Anything that made me feel like I was building something, even if I didn't know what that something would become. Nights were long and money was tight, but I was breathing in a way I never had at home. My father called once a week at first. Always from the garage or the car, always speaking in a hushed voice like he was afraid someone might overhear him offering me affection. "Are you eating enough?" he'd whisper. "Do you need anything?" I'd tell him I was fine even when I wasn't. I didn't want him to worry. Or maybe I didn't want to give my mother another reason to say I was a burden. But as the weeks passed, his calls grew shorter, then less frequent, then distant. Sometimes he'd start to say something. "There's something you should know," but he'd cut himself off the moment. I asked what he meant. I didn't understand it then, but now I know fear was always living inside him. Fear of my mother, fear of truth, fear of what would happen if he chose me. Late in November, just as the stores began hanging Christmas lights and the air filled with the scent of pine-scented candles, I received a certified envelope addressed to me. The return address was from a law office in Maplewood. I didn't know any lawyers. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was a mistake. Inside was a letter from my grandmother's attorney. She had passed away earlier that year. The letter stated there was a small trust set aside for me, nothing extravagant but meaningful. Enough to help pay for college or start a small business. The trust, however, was frozen pending parental review. Parental review. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at those words, my heart beat loud in my ears. Why would my parents have anything to do with a trust meant for me? I didn't need anyone to explain what frozen really meant. It meant blocked, controlled, hidden. I called the attorney listed at the bottom of the letter. He sounded surprised, too surprised, when he realized I had received the notice. "I assumed your parents informed you years ago," he said, slowly choosing each word with caution. When I told him they hadn't, he hesitated long enough for my stomach to twist. Finally, he said, "I'm not at liberty to discuss everything, but..." The documents we received were difficult to verify. 2 signatures did not match earlier records. Forged signatures. The phrase stuck in my throat like glass. I thanked him and hung up, then called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. The moment she answered, the temperature in the room dropped. "What?" she said sharply, as if my name on her caller ID had personally offended her. I asked her about the trust. I asked her why I had never been told. I asked her why the documents didn't match. Her response was a storm I should have seen coming. "How dare you accuse us of anything?" she snapped. "We raised you. We fed you. We clothed you. And this is how you repay us? By chasing money like some heartless stranger?" I tried to explain that I wasn't chasing anything, I just wanted the truth. But she was already spiraling, hurling accusations faster than I could process them. You always twist things, you always look for drama, you were always the problem, Elena. Always. Her voice was a knife sharp and familiar. Then my father got on the line. I could hear my mother breathing heavily in the background. His voice was tight, urgent. "This isn't the time," he whispered. "Please don't call again tonight." And then he hung up. I stared at my phone long after the call ended, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. Somewhere inside me, something cracked, not loudly but deeply, like a hairline fracture spreading through bone. That was when the memories began replaying themselves in painful clarity. Every Christmas dinner where she insulted me under the guise of joking. Every whispered correction, every fake smile in front of neighbors, every time she told relatives I was difficult or overly emotional. Every moment of childhood betrayal that I had convinced myself was normal. For the first time, all the pieces aligned: the humiliation, the gaslighting, the attic secrets, the trust hidden from me. My mother wasn't just strict, she wasn't just controlling. She was terrified of what I might uncover. The silence that followed the phone call was heavy, suffocating. It curled around me as I decorated my tiny studio with a strand of dollar store lights. I baked a batch of cheap sugar cookies and wrapped a knitted scarf I had been saving for my father, even though I doubted I'd see him again. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the apartment, soft and lonely. I checked my phone every few minutes. Christmas Eve came, then midnight, then morning. Nothing. Not a call, not a text, not a message, not even a mistake dial from the house I spent 18 years living in. I kept staring at the phone, waiting for it to light up, waiting for that one small sign that maybe, just maybe, they cared enough to say 2 words, "Merry Christmas." But the screen stayed black. On Christmas morning at 10:42, a notification finally appeared. For one hopeful second, my heart lifted. Then I saw the message. It was from my mother. 7 words. "Do not contact us again until you apologize." Apologize. For what? For asking about the trust that was legally mine, for wanting to understand the forged documents, for daring to exist outside her control. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand, realizing something with chilling clarity. She wasn't angry because I had done something wrong. She was angry because I had asked questions she never intended me to ask. Questions that threatened the story she had crafted for herself. Questions that threatened her control. That was the moment the abandonment became official. There was no fight, no goodbye, no explanation. Just silence. Cold, intentional silence. I cried into my pillow until the fabric was drenched. Grief mixed with anger, confusion mixed with clarity. I felt hollowed out and strangely steady all at once. Because beneath the heartbreak, a new feeling began to rise, something small and fragile but real. Survival. I wiped my face, stood up, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were swollen, but something in them looked different. Stronger. Sharper. I whispered to my reflection, "This will not be the end of me." And it wasn't. Over the next weeks, I took every extra shift I could. I studied harder. I saved every dollar. I began sketching business ideas in a cheap notebook. Words like trauma recovery, emotional healing, boundaries, empowerment. I didn't know it then, but those scribbles were the first seeds of the empire I would one day build. The silence of that Christmas didn't break me. It rebuilt me. Years later, standing on my parents' porch with my hand gripping the doorknob, I realized something else. They had abandoned me to punish me, but their silence had shaped me into a woman they could no longer control. And this time, I wasn't coming home for a seat at their table. I was coming home for the truth. The first winter I spent truly on my own felt like stepping into a world without gravity. There was no one to tell me where to stand, how to sit, what to fix about myself before I walked outside. The silence in my tiny studio apartment above the laundromat didn't ache the way silence used to. It felt clean. It felt like breathing after holding my lungs tight for 18 years. The studio didn't look like much peeling paint around the window frame. a radiator that hissed like it was fighting for its life, and a single overhead bulb that flickered whenever someone downstairs slammed a washing machine lid. My mattress lay directly on the floor, shoved into the corner beside a thrift store lamp missing its shade. But every inch of that room belonged to me. Every breath, every decision, every mistake. For the first time, the air wasn't thick with someone else's expectations. I worked the breakfast shift at the diner 6 days a week. The regulars ordered the same thing every morning: black coffee, scrambled eggs, rye toast. Some left $2 tips. Some left none. On good days, a businesswoman in a tailored coat would leave me a crisp 20, and I'd slip it into a jar labeled "Someday." In the evenings, I shelved books at the community college library, breathing in the comforting smell of worn pages and old carpet. Psychology textbooks, business strategy guides, memoirs of people who climbed out of the shadows their childhood left behind. At the time, I didn't realize I was slowly climbing out of mine. One night at the diner, during a lull between the dinner rush and closing, a young woman slid into a booth with tears streaming down her face. She tried to hide it, but heartbreak has a sound, shaky breath, quiet, sniffling, a kind of trembling that radiates from the hands outward. I poured her a cup of tea and sat across from her during my break. She whispered that she'd fought with her mother, that she felt crazy and overly sensitive, that every conversation twisted into something she couldn't recognize. I knew that story. I had lived that story. "You're not crazy," I told her. "You're being gaslit." She blinked at me like no one had ever named her pain before. In that moment, I felt a pull in my chest, something like purpose, something like recognition. It was the first time I realized the years of family trauma I carried weren't just wounds. They were knowledge. And knowledge could help people. After that night, I became a quiet listener. A translator of emotions, a guide for strangers who didn't yet understand why their hearts felt like bruises. I didn't charge anyone. I didn't even think of it as work. It was just something I did because someone should have done it for me. On days when the diner was slow, I walked to the public library and camped out at a table in the back. I read every book I could find about boundaries, trauma, healing from toxic parents, emotional manipulation, and rebuilding self-worth. I filled notebooks with ideas for tools and worksheets, ways to help people understand what had happened to them and how to escape it with their dignity intact. Those notebooks would become the blueprint of a future business I had no idea I was building. In the evenings, I experimented with small projects. I wrote a digital journal filled with prompts for people healing from emotional wounds. I created affirmation cards and uploaded them to an online shop. I recorded a handful of simple guided meditations with a cheap microphone, whispering reminders I wish someone had told me growing up. You are enough. You are allowed to rest. You are not your mother's voice. Most of these projects barely made any money. Sometimes $5, sometimes none. But every sale felt like a tiny spark lighting up the darkness. The first real flame came from a $1 digital workbook I titled Healing After Toxic Parents. I uploaded it at midnight, unsure if anyone would ever read it. 3 days later, my inbox exploded with messages. Hundreds of downloads. A popular mental health blog featured it in an article called Resources for Survivors of Family Trauma. People wrote things like, "Your words made me feel understood for the first time, and I thought I was alone until now." I cried in my studio that night, overwhelmed by the idea that something I created could help someone breathe easier. My audience grew quietly at first, then steadily. A licensed therapist reached out and said she'd been recommending my workbook to her clients. She asked if I'd co-create a mini-course with her about breaking generational cycles. The idea terrified me, but I said yes. The course sold almost 500 copies in its first month. Suddenly, my someday jar wasn't empty anymore. Leaving the diner felt like shedding an old skin. One night, after a customer shouted at me for bringing the wrong dressing, something inside me snapped, not loud, not violent, but certain. I untied my apron, folded it on the counter, and walked out the back door without saying goodbye. I didn't need the tips anymore. I didn't need the humiliation. I didn't need to shrink to keep the peace. I could finally choose myself. As my audience grew, so did the need for structure. I spent long nights creating a business plan, sketching out ideas for emotional tools, support groups, community resources. I settled on a name, North Star Guidance. The North Star had been the only thing I used to stare at through my bedroom window growing up, silently wishing for a different life. Naming my platform after it felt like honoring that younger version of me. One evening, as I was answering emails, a message popped up in my inbox from a tech founder named Daniel Brooks. He'd seen my workbook featured online and believed I could scale what I was doing into something much bigger. "You need an app," he said. "Something people can carry in their pockets." I reread his message 5 times, unsure if I should feel excited or terrified. Anytime someone offered to help me, I felt myself bracing, waiting for the catch, for the trap, for the manipulation I had been raised to expect. But Daniel wasn't pushy. He offered to build a simple prototype for free, just to show you what's possible. His kindness unsettled me in a way I wasn't used to. Kindness had never been safe in my childhood home. Still, something in me, some part of me that had learned to rise from silence, said yes. We created a basic emotional check-in app, nothing fancy, just a few daily prompts and boundary-setting scripts. I sent it to 100 of my followers for feedback. Within 24 hours, dozens responded, begging for more features, more guidance, more ways to understand the wounds they carried. That's when I realized the truth I had been building toward. Without knowing it, my pain wasn't just my own. It belonged to thousands of strangers with stories like mine, people whose hearts had been shaped by toxic parents, people searching for healing after emotional trauma. One night a month later, I received a call from a private number. I nearly let it go to voicemail until I heard my father's voice. "Elena, I heard about your business. Your grandmother would be proud." There was a pause. I heard him inhale, shaky and uncertain. "There were things she wanted you to have," he whispered. "Things your mother hid. Things I should have protected." Before I could ask him what he meant, I heard my mother shouting in the background. The phone rustled, then the line went dead. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, staring at my reflection in the window, older, stronger, but still carrying the outline of the girl my mother tried to erase. That night, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would build something bigger than the silence they left me in. I would turn every wound into wisdom, every betrayal into purpose, every lonely Christmas into something worth remembering. And whether my mother liked it or not, I refused to disappear. Momentum didn't arrive with fireworks. It slipped into my life quietly, almost shyly, like it didn't want to startle me. One morning, I woke up to a flood of notifications, more downloads of my workbook, more messages from strangers thanking me for putting words to feelings they'd carried for years, more comments saying they finally understood their own childhoods after reading my writing. I sat there on my mattress, surrounded by the glow of my cheap laptop screen, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: direction. North Star Guidance wasn't supposed to grow. It started as survival, a way to process the wreckage of a family I no longer spoke to. But somehow other people found me. People with toxic parents, people who'd been gaslit, manipulated, pushed into silence. People carrying family drama they'd never been allowed to name. They saw themselves in my words. And that connection lit a spark I didn't know I was capable of. At first, I thought the sudden attention was a fluke, a random wave that would fade in a week. But it didn't. Every morning brought more proof that something real was building. My $1 workbook on healing from toxic parents continued to spread through online support groups. Someone posted it on a forum for adult children of narcissists. Someone else shared it on a mental health subreddit. A blogger included it in a list called Top Resources for Survivors of Gaslighting. The day the blog post went live, my phone nearly overheated from notifications. Downloads tripled. Sales that used to crawl in 1 or 2 a day suddenly jumped into the hundreds. I remember staring at my Stripe balance in disbelief, the numbers shifting from tens to hundreds to thousands. It wasn't life-changing money yet, but for someone who had spent her whole adult life counting quarters for laundry, it felt like discovering oxygen. The shift didn't just happen online. People started emailing me personal stories, long, heartbreaking messages about mothers who manipulated them, fathers who stayed silent, siblings who turned their back. I read every word, sometimes crying quietly at my little table by the window. They weren't just telling me their pain. They were trusting me with it. And that responsibility pushed me forward like nothing else ever had. Then came the message from Dr. Naomi Whitfield, a licensed therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. She wrote to say she'd been recommending my workbook to clients dealing with mother-daughter conflict and emotional abuse. She wanted to collaborate on a digital mini-course. Her confidence in me was disorienting. For a moment, I felt like a child again, hearing my mother's voice in my mind. "You're not qualified. You're overreacting. Who do you think you are?" But the woman I was becoming refused to shrink. I wrote back and said yes. Working with Naomi was like finding a missing piece. She had clinical expertise. I had lived experience. Together, we created a course called Breaking Generational Cycles, filled with exercises on boundary setting, emotional regulation, and understanding the long-term wounds of family betrayal. We priced it low, $50, because we wanted to make it accessible. When the first launch email went out, I held my breath. Within 2 days, over 300 people enrolled. I sat on the floor of my studio after reading the final sales report, smiling so hard my cheeks ached. For the first time, I realized what I was building wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline, one I wish someone had handed me years ago. But success didn't feel entirely safe. Growing up with financial manipulation and hidden inheritance secrets had taught me that money could destroy families. I caught myself flinching each time my revenue increased, waiting for something terrible to happen. It felt like the universe would punish me for wanting more than survival. The fear wasn't logical, but trauma rarely is. Leaving the diner was the first step toward reclaiming control. The night I quit, a customer yelled at me for bringing the wrong dressing. I stood there holding a plate of cold salad, listening to him rant when something clicked into place. I wasn't the girl who accepted humiliation anymore. I didn't have to stay small to stay safe. I walked into the kitchen, untied my apron, folded it neatly on the counter, and left without telling anyone. The cold air outside hit my face like freedom. With the diner behind me, I poured everything into North Star guidance. I studied branding, marketing, user psychology, anything that could help me shape this flickering spark into something brighter. I built a small email list, wrote weekly newsletters about healing, created more worksheets, recorded gentle audio guides for people struggling with gaslighting and self-doubt. Slowly, the community grew. And then came the message that changed everything. The subject line read, "Your work has huge potential." It was from Daniel Brooks, a tech founder whose name I only vaguely recognized. He told me he'd been studying emotional wellness platforms and believed my content had the potential to scale far beyond digital downloads. "You need an app," he wrote, "something personalized. Something that makes emotional healing accessible in people's pockets." An app. The idea terrified me. Tech meant coding, investing, risk, things that felt too big for someone like me. But Daniel's message didn't sound like pressure. It sounded like someone holding open a door I didn't know existed. We met in a cafe downtown. He was kind, soft-spoken, and surprisingly attentive. Instead of telling me what to do, he listened to my story, my fears, my dreams. He told me he believed emotional recovery tools were becoming the next major wave in wellness. And he thought I could be at the forefront. Before I could spiral into self-doubt, he offered to build a prototype for free. "No pressure," he said. "Let's just see if people like it." Together, we created a simple beta app with daily emotional check-in scripts for handling manipulation and small exercises for people dealing with toxic parents. When we shared it with a test group of my followers, the feedback was overwhelming. People said it made them feel safe, understood, less alone. And watching the app take shape felt like watching a new version of myself take shape too. one who wasn't afraid of success anymore, one who understood that helping others didn't make me a target. It made me whole. Then one night in early spring, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice trembled through the speaker, quieter than I remembered. "I saw the app," he said. "Your grandmother. She would have been proud." Something cracked in me, grief, maybe, or longing. But then he whispered something that chilled me to my core. "There were things she meant to leave you. Things your mother hid. Things I should have told you years ago." Before I could speak, my mother's voice shouted from somewhere behind him. The phone rustled violently, and the call ended. I sat in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. Outside, snow drifted under the streetlights. Inside, an old ache pulsed in my chest. Answers were coming. Answers to questions I'd carried since childhood. Answers about the trust, the documents, the attic secrets. But one thing was already clear. My success, the one they ignored me through, the one they suddenly needed me for, was only just beginning. And my parents' silence was about to break. I didn't recognize the moment my life began to tilt towards something irreversible. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, while I sat at my thrift store desk sipping instant coffee from a chipped mug. Outside my studio window, the sun was barely awake, casting a thin strip of pale light over the laundromat roof. I was answering emails from people who had downloaded my workbook messages, filled with gratitude, confusion, fear, hope, when a subject line popped up that made my breath catch. Feature request, the young woman behind North Star Guidance. I stared at the words, convinced it was spam. No one from Forbes would ever contact me. Not the girl who once sat alone on Christmas morning waiting for a family that never showed up. Not the daughter who'd spent years shrinking herself to survive. But when I clicked the message, the signature at the bottom confirmed it: Maya Decker, senior writer, Forbes magazine. My hands shook so badly I had to set down my mug. The email said my digital products were gaining traction in online communities, that North Star Guidance had reshaped conversations about emotional healing, and that she wanted to feature my work in a long-form article. The words blurred as I reread them, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, as if summoned from the past, my mother's voice drifted through my mind. "Don't think you're special. You always exaggerate. No one wants to hear your story." That voice had lived inside me for years, a shadow I couldn't shake. But now another voice spoke louder, the one I'd been growing quietly, steadily, painfully. "You did this. You built this. You are allowed to be seen." I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my sweatshirt and typed back. Yes, I'd be honored. The interview was scheduled for the following week. When the day arrived, I sat in my tiny studio with my laptop propped on 2 old textbooks and tried not to look nervous. Maya appeared on the screen with a warm smile, her hair pulled back, eyes bright with curiosity. She asked about my childhood, my experiences with gaslighting, the grief of estranged family relationships, and how my pain became the blueprint for North Star Guidance. I answered honestly, not naming my parents, not sharing private details, but speaking openly about family trauma, manipulation, and healing. When she asked what drove me, I said quietly, I wanted to give people what I needed most when I was young, a way to understand their hurt and a reason not to blame themselves. She sat silently for a moment, then said, "You didn't just build a business, you built a lifeline." Her words stayed with me long after the interview ended. 3 days later, the article went live. The headline took my breath away: the young woman behind FIFYMILIO no LLR wellness empire. Underneath, a full-color photo of me taken from my website looked back at me with a confidence I had fought to earn. The article spread like wildfire. Messages poured into my inbox, followers doubled then tripled. My courses sold out, podcasters requested interviews. A TikTok therapist with millions of followers called my story a revolution in emotional recovery. My world cracked open in a way I never expected. And then the phone rang. It was a Maplewood number. For 5 years I had trained myself not to hope when that area code appeared. I had become frighteningly good at ignoring the ache that rose whenever I saw my hometown on the screen. But this time something cold and electric crawled up my spine. I let it go to voicemail. When the message icon appeared, I pressed play. Elena, it's your mother. 5 words. 5 years of silence collapsed under them. Her voice was saccharine sweet, dipped in honey and denial. We saw the article. Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud of you. We always knew you'd do something amazing. I froze. The air thickened. Proud. They ignored me for 5 Christmases, missed every birthday, blocked my number, hung up on me the night I asked about the trust. Now they were proud I could hear faint Christmas music in the background, decorations being hung, laughter. The same laughter that echoed through the walls of our house the night they left me alone in my studio apartment, waiting for a call that never came. Her voice brightened. We'd love to see you. The whole family wants to celebrate together. We're hosting a Christmas reunion in your honor. In my honor. 5 years of abandonment rewritten in a single sentence. She ended with, "Call us back. We miss you." I didn't return the call. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Another Maplewood number. My father this time. He didn't disguise the tremor in his voice. Your mother, she gets carried away. But I'm proud of you, truly. It'd mean a lot to see you. It's been too long. There was sadness in his tone, regret simmering beneath every word. For a moment, my chest ached with the old longing for him to choose me, defend me, acknowledge the years I spent feeling invisible. But the ache passed. He had chosen silence for most of my life. He had watched my mother humiliate me and never stepped in. He had watched her erase me one holiday at a time. Still, he added softly, I hope you'll come home. I didn't respond. That evening, while typing a blog post for my website, another email arrived from my mother's address. The subject line read, Family Christmas Reunion, in honor of our daughter's achievements. The message was dripping with performance. We want to celebrate your success with the whole family. Everyone is excited to see our brilliant daughter. Your success reflects our family values. Family values. The words punched me harder than any insult ever had. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed through my empty apartment. Their values were silence, control, gaslighting, erasure. I had built everything despite them, not because of them. And now, with the world watching, they suddenly wanted me back. I spent the rest of the night pacing my small kitchen, torn between fury, grief, and a strange, quiet curiosity. Part of me wanted to reject the invitation and never look back. Another part, the wounded child buried deep inside, wanted answers. Why did they erase me? Why did they hide the trust? Why did my father whisper warnings he never explained? Why did my mother act like I was a threat instead of a daughter? By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going home for reconciliation. I wasn't going home to become their trophy. I wasn't going home to give them credit for a life they abandoned. I was going home for the truth, for the documents in the attic, for the secrets buried under years of silence, for the clarity I'd been denied my entire life. And maybe for the first time ever, I was going home for myself. As I packed my bag later that afternoon, a calm settled over me, not peace exactly, but resolve. The kind that comes when you finally stop running from your past and decide to face it head on. When I stepped out into the cold winter air, locking my apartment behind me, I whispered to the empty street, this time I'm not walking into their home, I'm walking into their lies. And for the first time in my life, I felt ready. I hadn't stepped on that porch in 5 years, yet the house seemed to inhale the moment I approached, as if it recognized my footsteps before I even reached the door. A shadow moved behind the living room curtains, quick, nervous, unmistakably human. My hand froze on the doorknob. It wasn't my mother's silhouette. Hers was sharper, more rigid. This figure was smaller, almost hesitant, and the second our eyes met, even through the fabric of the curtain, it disappeared. A chill crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. The door opened before I could knock. My father stood there thinner than I remembered, shoulders sloped inward as though gravity had been unkind to him. His hair, once dark and neat, was now streaked with gray and uncombed. His eyes flickered across my face with a mixture of relief and dread. "Elena," he whispered, like saying my name out loud might summon trouble. "Hi, Dad," I said. He stepped aside to let me in, his hand trembling slightly as he held the door. The smell hit me first, cinnamon lemon polish, and the faint trace of pine. The same holiday scent they'd used for years back when I thought it meant joy instead of pressure. Walking into that house felt like stepping backward into a version of myself I had outgrown. The floorboards beneath my boots creaked the same way they always had. The entryway mirror reflected a memory me at 16, my mother behind me adjusting my posture before the neighbors arrived, whispering, "A lady doesn't slouch." I straightened instinctively. Then I forced myself to relax. My mother appeared from the kitchen, her smile brittle, her eyes calculating. She wore a perfectly chosen holiday dress, emerald green with pearls at the collar. She looked like she had walked straight out of a magazine spread about holiday elegance, except her expression carried the sharpness of a woman who had rehearsed every line she intended to say. "Oh, sweetheart," she exclaimed, arms outstretched. I didn't move toward her. Her arms dropped after a beat too long. "You look good," she added, her tone featherlight but strained. "Success suits you." "Hi, Mom," I replied evenly. Her gaze flicked quickly, almost involuntarily, to my bag, a quick check for what I might have brought into her house. When she didn't see anything alarming, she exhaled, relieved. The living room had been redecorated since I left. New stone fireplace, expensive furniture, carefully curated holiday decor that looked like it had been arranged by an interior designer. But as my eyes scanned the mantel, the bookshelves, the photo displays on the walls, I saw it immediately. There wasn't a single photo of me. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not even from the years before things fell apart. They had erased me. My stomach tightened. My mother must have noticed me looking because she launched into a rapid explanation about renovations, updated decor, wanting a clean, modern look. But I didn't miss the quick flicker of panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to look this closely. My father touched my elbow lightly. "Dinner's almost ready," he said quietly. His voice cracked on the last word. My mother shot him a warning glance, sharp as a blade. The same look I remembered from childhood, the one that meant, "Keep quiet, don't ruin this." We sat around the kitchen island while my mother busied herself with ladles and serving dishes, narrating every action like she was hosting a cooking show. She made it sound like she had spent days preparing this dinner just for us, as if 5 years of Christmases without me had never existed. As if I were simply a daughter home from college, not the estranged child they had abandoned. She placed a dish in front of me. "Your favorite," she said brightly. "Stuffed rosemary chicken." "I haven't eaten that in years," I replied. She froze, smile twitching. My father cleared his throat softly. "Why don't you show Elena the living room decorations?" he said, trying to smooth the tension. But my mother didn't like suggestions, not from him, not from anyone. She glared at him before forcing a smile back onto her face. "Sure," she said. "Come see the tree." I followed her into the living room. The tree was tall, elegant, dripping with white lights and gold ornaments, a magazine-perfect display. It was the kind of tree she always wanted, impressive, flawless, soulless. On the table beside it sat a stack of holiday cards. I picked one up, a photo of my parents and Mason standing in front of the same tree. My mother beamed proudly. Mason grinned. My father looked tired. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't even mentioned in the greeting inside. My mother snatched the card from my hand so quickly it startled me. "Old photos," she muttered. "We misplaced the new ones." My father, who had followed us quietly, leaned closer to me and murmured, "Go upstairs when you can. Check the attic." My heart skipped. The attic. He nodded, eyes darting toward the kitchen where my mother was clanging dishes louder than necessary. "Before tonight. before she gets rid of things. What things he swallowed hard. You'll understand. It was the same tone he used years ago when he whispered, "One day, the truth will find you." The same tone he used whenever my mother was within earshot. She called us back to the kitchen, then irritation already spreading across her face like a crack in glass. "What are you two whispering about? Nothing," my father said quickly. Her eyes narrowed. Dinner was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that trembles with everything unsaid. Forks clinked against plates. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. My father stared down at his food, avoiding both of our gazes. Mason's chair remained empty. Apparently he was arriving tomorrow for the big family celebration, the reunion my mother had staged to parade me around like a trophy. Halfway through the meal I asked, "Where's the bathroom upstairs? I want to wash my hands." My mother's smile tightened at the edges. "I'll show," I remember I said, standing. My father coughed lightly, his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something urgent. I climbed the stairs slowly, the old carpeting muffling my steps. Every inch of the hallway felt haunted by memories. Mason slamming doors, whispered arguments behind my parents' bedroom wall, the night I locked myself in my room to escape one of my mother's lectures. When I reached the attic door, I froze. The brass lock was the same. The chipped white paint, the faint scratch marks where I once tried to pick it with a hairpin when I was 12. I reached above the doorframe on instinct, and my hand closed around a small metal key. She'd hidden it in the same spot for 20 years. My breath trembled as I slid the key into the lock. The attic smelled like dust pine and forgotten winters. A single bulb hung overhead, flickering weakly. Boxes lined the walls, holiday decorations, old clothes, relics from a family narrative my mother had crafted, polished, and protected. And then I saw it. The cedar chest, tucked in the far corner, exactly where it was the night she caught me opening it. My hands shook as I knelt in front of it. I hesitated, listening for footsteps on the stairs. Nothing, just the hum of the heater downstairs. I lifted the lid. Inside lay the past she tried to bury. Hospital envelopes, legal forms, financial documents. A letter addressed to me from my grandmother dated 20 years ago never opened. A birth certificate with handwriting that didn't match the one I had. And copies of 2 trust documents, one naming me as beneficiary, the other with my name crossed out. My chest tightened. Everything in that chest confirmed what I had feared, suspected, and felt deep in my bones. My mother hadn't just abandoned me. She had erased me, legally, financially, emotionally, piece by piece. A floorboard creaked behind me. My breath froze in my throat. I turned slowly, heart pounding. Someone was standing in the attic doorway, and whatever expression they wore told me everything in this house was about to change forever. Mason stood in the doorway like he'd wandered into the wrong movie, wide-eyed, startled, his breath visible in the cold attic air. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to see any of this. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The single bulb flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the floorboards. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, voice cracking. I closed the cedar chest, slowly keeping my hands planted on the lid. "Looking for old decorations," I said, trying to sound casual. His gaze darted to the chest. His throat bobbed. "You were never allowed in here." "Yeah," I said, my voice dry. "I remember." He stepped inside his weight, making the attic boards groan. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, older in a tired way, dark hollows under his eyes, a tense set to his jaw. Yet there was still something boyish in the way he shifted from foot to foot, nervously tugging at the cuff of his sweatshirt. "Mom doesn't want anyone messing around with this stuff," he whispered. "That's obvious," I replied. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally sighed. "Look, maybe you shouldn't be digging. She'll lose it if she knows." "I'm aware," I said, standing so the chest blocked his view of the documents inside. "But I'm not 12 anymore." His eyes flicked toward the stairs. "Just be careful. She's been on edge. More than usual. More than usual." That explained the sharpness in her voice, the tension in her smile downstairs. The entire house felt wired, like one wrong movement could shatter the fragile performance she'd built. "What do you know, Mason?" I asked quietly. He froze. His eyes widened for a split second before he schooled his expression. "What do you mean?" I stepped closer. "You knew I wasn't supposed to be up here. You knew she'd lose it, and you look terrified." "So what do you know?" His hands curled into fists. He looked away. "Dinner's almost ready," he muttered before turning toward the stairs. But that flinch, that quick twitch when I asked the question, told me everything. He knew something. Something big. Something he didn't dare say. When he disappeared down the staircase, I reopened the cedar chest with trembling fingers. The documents weren't just suspicious, they were damning. Hospital forms with crossed-out dates. 2 versions of my birth certificate, neither matching the one I had. Legal documents addressed to my father but signed in handwriting that looked eerily like my mother's. Letters from my grandmother that never reached me. And the trust documents, one naming me the primary beneficiary, the other with my name violently scribbled out. I took photos of everything, my breath unsteady as I documented each piece. It felt like each flash from my phone exposed a fracture in my childhood I had pretended wasn't there. For years, I told myself they were just dysfunctional, flawed, hurtful, but not malicious. Now I wasn't so sure. My phone buzzed in my hand, jolting me out of my thoughts. A text from my mother appeared on the screen. "Dinner. Now." Even through text, I could hear the control. I slipped the documents back into the chest, though the knowledge no longer fit inside. It pulsed through me: anger, dread, grief, clarity. I closed the attic door behind me, relocked it, and headed downstairs, the weight of the truth pressing against my ribs. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, silence hit me like a wall. My mother was stirring something on the stove with manic precision. My father sat at the table, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on his plate. Neither spoke at first. Then my mother turned, smile stretched too wide. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I said, sitting. Her eyes flicked over me, searching for cracks. "You were up there a while." "Lots of boxes," I replied. She forced a laugh. "Oh yes, your father hoards everything, old junk." She said it casually, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. My father lifted his head. Our eyes met briefly. He looked exhausted, guilty, like a man carrying truth in his pockets and terrified someone might ask him to empty them. Dinner was a quiet war. Mason barely touched his food. My father jumped slightly every time my mother moved, and my mother's cheerful chatter had the brittle tone of someone keeping an entire house of cards upright by sheer force of will. I didn't engage in any of it. I simply watched. Every rehearsed compliment she gave me, every tight smile, every perfectly timed laugh, every sidelong glance she exchanged with my father. It was all a performance. Halfway through the meal, she launched into a stream of sugary praise. "We're just so proud of you, sweetheart. You've done so well for yourself. Such success. And Forbes, my goodness, imagine that our daughter in Forbes." The emphasis on our daughter wasn't accidental. It was ownership disguised as affection. A claim she abandoned 5 years ago, suddenly reclaimed the moment it became useful to her. I swallowed a piece of chicken that tasted like dust. It didn't happen overnight. I worked hard. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I know. And we supported you the whole way." My fork clattered against my plate. Mason's head snapped up. My father closed his eyes. "Supported me," I repeated softly. My mother blinked. "Of course. We always believed in you. You erased me from photos. You hid my trust. You ignored me every Christmas. You told me I twisted everything. You watched me walk out and never looked for me. You pretended I didn't exist. My memories don't match yours," I said. Her smile twitched. "Well, you always were sensitive." There it was, the familiar dagger. The phrase she used to end every disagreement, every wound, every moment she wanted to dismiss. I took a slow breath. "You said that a lot when I was young. Sensitive, dramatic, misremembering." Her knuckles whitened around her wineglass. And yet I added, my memory has always been painfully accurate. Her eyes narrowed. What are you implying? My father tensed. Mason swallowed hard. I went to the attic, I said. The room pulsed with sudden silence. My mother's face drained of color. You had no reason you kept legal documents up there. I don't know what you're talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Her voice sharpened. Elena, you are making something out of nothing. I leaned forward. Then why did Dad tell me to look? A gasp escaped her lips. She turned to him, fury blazing. You did what my father shrank his shoulders, folding inward. She deserves to know what I asked. My mother slammed her wine glass down, liquid sloshing onto the table. Enough, we will not dredge up old family drama over dinner. This is a celebration. Her voice cracked on the last word. I stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her eyes jittering around the room as if terrified someone might expose the cracks she fought to hide. Mason pushed his plate away, his hands shaking. Mom, just tell her. Tell her what? I whispered. Everything inside my mother snapped. Her mask fell away in an instant. Nothing happened. Nothing. You don't know what you're talking about. You were always ungrateful. Always causing trouble. Always trying to make us look bad. You're doing it again right now. She stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Her hands were fists at her sides. She trembled with a fury so familiar it felt like stepping back into my childhood. You think you know everything because of some little business, she spat. Because strangers read your silly articles. You think that makes you better than us. My father stood suddenly. Clarissa. She spun on him. Not a word. The kitchen vibrated with tension. And for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I didn't fold. I didn't cower. I simply said in a quiet, steady voice, "Show me the truth, or I will find it myself." My mother inhaled sharply, teeth clenched. My father looked at me with something like apology, and Mason whispered, Elena, there's something else, and it's not in the attic. My mother whipped toward him. Mason, don't. But the fear in his eyes told me the truth. The attic was only the beginning, and the secrets in this house ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. Mason looked like he was about to be sick. His face had gone pale, almost gray, and his hands trembled as he pushed his chair back from the table. My mother lunged toward him so fast the air seemed to split around her. "Mason, don't you dare," she hissed. He flinched but didn't sit back down. His eyes darted to me, then to my father, then back to me again as though searching for anyone who could tell him what to do. But no one spoke. The only sound in the kitchen was the faint tick of the clock above the stove, counting down the seconds of the lie we were all breathing inside. "Tell me," I said, my voice low, steady. "Whatever it is, I want the truth." My mother's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Don't be ridiculous. He doesn't know anything." But Mason did know. I could see it all over him, in the tightness of his shoulders, the sheen of sweat along his hairline, the guilt flashing across his eyes. Whatever he had been holding inside had been eating him alive for years. He swallowed hard. "It's not just the trust." My mother slammed her palm on the table. My father jumped. "I didn't." "Mason." Her voice was deadly. "Not one more word." He stepped away from her, shaking his head. "I can't do this anymore, Mom." She paled. "You can and you will." But he kept going. "Dad told me something once about Grandma, about you, and about why the trust wasn't given to Elena." My father closed his eyes, his jaw trembling. My mother stared at him with such venom that for a moment I wondered if he'd survive the night. "What did he say?" I asked. Mason's voice cracked. "He said Grandma wanted Elena to have everything. All of it, he said. He said she knew Elena would need protection." The room tilted. My breath caught in my throat. Protection, from whom my mother let out a strangled noise. "Your grandmother was senile." My father whispered she wasn't. Mason wiped his palms on his jeans. "Dad also told me you fought with the attorney. that you demanded changes, that you insisted Elena be removed. My mother's chair scraped violently as she stood. You were a child. You misunderstood. No, Mason said, voice small. I remember. My father finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed with years of shame. He's right. Those two words broke something open in the air. My mother let out a furious, strangled gasp. You traitor! He didn't look at her. He looked at me. Your grandmother trusted me to protect what she gave you. I failed. Heat surged up my spine, but I couldn't speak. The betrayal tasted metallic in my mouth. My mother spat. You don't owe her anything. We built this family. We sacrificed. No, I cut in my voice, razor sharp. You controlled. You manipulated. You lied. Her eyes snapped to me, burning with decades of held-back fury. You ungrateful little stop, my father said, suddenly louder than I'd ever heard him. His voice thundered through the room like a shock wave. Just stop, Clarissa. She froze mid-breath. None of us moved. My father stood slowly, shoulders slumped but eyes clear. You can scream at me, you can blame me, but you will not rewrite what you did. My mother's lips trembled. I did what I had to. No, he said again, you did what you wanted. For a moment, the entire world seemed to still. It was the first crack in a wall I thought would never fall. A lifetime of complicity began to shake itself loose. Mason stared down at his hands. That's not everything, he whispered. My stomach dropped. What else? He glanced toward the hall as if expecting my mother to pounce. I overheard something when I was 14, he said. You and Dad were in the kitchen late at night. You were fighting. Dad said the dates didn't match. Something about when you were born. My mother's face drained of color so quickly she looked like a ghost. Mason, stop. But Mason didn't stop. He shook his head. He said something wasn't right, that you knew it. And you said he needed to keep quiet for the sake of the family. My father dropped his gaze to the table. I felt cold all over. The dates of what no one answered. You're talking about medical records, I said softly. Aren't you silence? My father whispered. It's complicated. My mother snapped. It's none of your business. It's my life, I shouted, startling even myself. The room vibrated with the force of it. Years of swallowed words, suppressed emotions, internalized shame, all of it burst out in one raw demand. My mother pointed at me, her hand shaking. You think your little business gives you the right to interrogate us. You think fame makes you better than your family. If you wanted to be my family, I said quietly, you should have acted like it. Her mouth snapped shut. I was alone for 5 Christmases, I continued, voice shaking, and you didn't so much as text me, not once. But the moment Forbes mentioned my name, you suddenly remembered I exist. My father's face crumpled. Mason covered his mouth with his hand. My mother's nostrils flared like she was struggling for breath. You don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. But I did. I saw it now, the patterns, the manipulation, the lies disguised as motherly concern. The truth shone through everything like harsh flashlight beams illuminating a dark room. This isn't about love, I said. It's about control. My mother scoffed, but the tremble in her jaw betrayed her. I controlled nothing. You controlled everything I said. The trust, the documents, our memories. Her eyes flashed. I did what was necessary. To protect who I asked. That silenced her. Not protect the family. Not protect me. Protect herself. Mason pushed back from the table. Elena, there's more. My mother lunged toward him, but my father grabbed her arm. Let him speak. She hissed like a trapped animal. He doesn't understand. He understands enough, my father said sharply. Mason's voice wavered. The family business is failing. Mom took out a huge loan and used parts of Grandma's estate as collateral. But the loan went bad. She needs money. She needs you. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My mother let out a howl. That isn't true, Mason stepped away from her. Yes, it is. My heart thudded painfully. So that's why you invited me home. Not love. Not forgiveness. Money. My mother screamed. "You owe us." "No," I said. "I owe you nothing." The house shook with her fury. My father didn't defend her this time. He didn't even look at her. He looked at me, softly, brokenly. "Your grandmother wanted you to have the truth," he said. "And I think it's finally time." I felt the weight of everything settle around me. The forged signatures, the erased inheritance, the manipulated childhood, the silence that had followed me out of this house 5 years ago. My mother snarled, "If you think you're going to ruin Christmas," I cut her off with a calm she had never been able to break. "Christmas isn't ruined. The performance is." She went still, absolutely still. That was when I knew. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing her version of me. And this time I wasn't playing the part. When Mason finally whispered, "I'm sorry," tears streaming down his face, I understood something else. The truth had already begun unraveling, and there was no way for her to stop it now. Christmas Eve used to feel like a cage. The house, the lights, the decorations, everything arranged just so always made me feel like I was walking into a scene rehearsed for an audience I didn't believe in. But this year, as I stood at the threshold of the dining room, I felt something entirely new settle into my chest. Resolve. The long table stretched across the room, covered in a white cloth embroidered with gold thread. Glittering ornaments hung from the chandelier above it, and each chair was adorned with a velvet ribbon. My mother had always insisted Christmas be picture perfect, but tonight the perfection looked brittle like porcelain ready to crack. Relatives began arriving in clusters, coats dusted with snow, voices too loud, faces too eager. Aunts who had never bothered to call me. Uncles who never questioned why I was always the quiet one. Cousins who parroted whatever story my mother fed them, believing every word. They greeted me with exaggerated warmth, their smiles bright and performative. "Look at you, Elena," one aunt exclaimed, clutching my hands like we were close. "We saw the Forbes article, so proud of you, sweetheart." "Sweetheart." Another cousin chimed in, "Your mother is just over the moon. She says she always knew you'd make it big." I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my smile polite. They weren't lying, they were repeating the lies they'd been told. In their minds, the family narrative was intact: the supportive parents, the gifted daughter, the picture-perfect home. A narrative built on my mother's stagecraft. My father drifted through the room like a ghost, offering small smiles, but avoiding my mother's gaze. Mason hovered near the drink table, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously every time someone said my name too loudly. My mother, meanwhile, moved from guest to guest, with the grace of a hostess auditioning for a holiday commercial. Her laughter bright, her tone rehearsed, her gestures precise. She was performing for them, but she would not perform for me. When dinner was finally served, everyone gathered around the table. I sat directly across from my mother, my father to my right, Mason to my left. There was a holiday roast, glazed carrots, cranberry chutney, and rolls brushed with butter, dishes she never made unless there was an audience. Once everyone settled, she stood and tapped her wine glass lightly. "I'd like to say a few words," she announced, smiling at the room as though it belonged to her. The conversations quieted. Forks lowered, all eyes shifted toward her. She placed a hand over her heart theatrically. "We are so grateful to have our family together tonight, and especially grateful that our dear Elena has come home. We've always supported her dreams, and seeing her success in Forbes, well..." She wiped an invisible tear from the corner of her eye. "We couldn't be prouder." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. My fingers curled slowly around the edge of my chair. Proud, supportive, grateful. I heard Mason's breath hitch beside me. My father leaned forward slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, as if bracing for something he couldn't stop but wished he could. My mother continued, beaming, "Family is everything. And I'm so glad Elena came back to celebrate with us. It means the world to us, doesn't it?" She looked at my father, clearly prompting him. He nodded barely. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke. Actually, I said softly, I came home for a different reason. The room stilled. My mother's smile froze at the corners. Conversations stopped entirely. Even the Christmas music playing faintly in the background suddenly seemed too loud. "Oh," she said lightly, though her voice wavered. "And what reason is that, sweetheart?" I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, the first trust document I had photographed in the attic. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost impressive. "I came for the truth," I said, sliding the envelope across the table toward her. The entire room seemed to shift. Chairs creaked. Someone gasped quietly. My mother kept her smile frozen in place. "What's this, dear?" she asked, though she didn't touch the envelope. "A trust document," I replied. "The original one. The one naming me as the beneficiary." A murmur rippled around the table. She laughed, too loud, too sharp. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm stating it plainly." I pulled out the second document, the altered one. "This version has my name crossed out." The gasp that followed was louder. My mother's mask cracked. Her hand shook as she finally reached for her wineglass. My father covered his face with one hand, shoulders slumping. An uncle leaned forward, confused. "What is she talking about?" My mother inhaled sharply. "She's misinterpreting things." "This is all—" "Don't," my father said, suddenly, voice thick. "Clarissa, don't." She turned toward him, eyes wide with rage. "Not now." But he didn't back down. "She's right," he whispered. She found the documents. A stunned silence fell over the table. My mother's face twisted. "You pathetic coward," she spat under her breath. I continued, my voice steady. "There's more. Financial ledgers showing money taken from Grandma's estate. Unauthorized loans under her name. Transactions you never reported. Things you tried to bury." An aunt covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "My God." My mother stood abruptly, chair screeching backward. "You are destroying Christmas." "No," I said. "I'm ending the performance." Her eyes burned into me. "You ungrateful. Ungrateful," I asked sharply. "For what?" "For being erased from photos for 5 Christmases of silence. For being told I was dramatic every time I cried. For being removed from my own inheritance." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time, she was speechless. My father rose slowly. "I knew it was wrong," he said to the room. "But I didn't stop it. I let her do it. And I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the last word. My mother stared at him with betrayal so deep it looked like hatred. Relatives were whispering, confused, horrified, unsure, whose version of reality they had been fed all these years. I felt strangely calm. "For 5 years I said you ignored me. You left me alone every Christmas. You didn't call. You didn't text. You didn't check if I was alive. But when Forbes published that article, suddenly I became your daughter again. Suddenly, I became someone worth inviting home." The silence that followed was ice cold. My mother finally managed a whisper. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "You didn't want me back. You wanted what you thought I could give you." There it was, the truth laid bare like a wound. My mother trembled. My father bowed his head. Mason stared at the table, tears in his eyes. The relatives sat stiffly, unsure where to look, the holiday dinner forgotten. And then I said the sentence that had been burning on my tongue since I stepped onto that porch. "I didn't come home for you. I came home for the truth." The entire room fell silent, utterly silent, and in that silence something inside me finally broke free. I stood up, gathered the documents, and walked toward the door without another word. No one stopped me. No one dared. Behind me, the world of my childhood cracked open, exposing everything that had been rotting beneath the surface all along. I didn't look back. Not once. The truth was behind me now. And I was done being quiet. I didn't feel triumphant as I walked away from the house. I didn't feel victorious or righteous or vindicated. I felt hollow. The cold air outside hit me like a wave sharp against my skin, and for a long moment I stood right there on the front walkway staring at my breath fogging into nothing. Inside voices were rising, my mother yelling, relatives arguing, chairs scraping, but the sounds felt far away, muffled, like I had stepped out of one world and into another. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel. My hands were still shaking. I replayed everything in my mind, the documents on the table, my mother's face draining of color, my father's voice cracking with guilt, Mason confessing things he should never have carried alone. For years, I had imagined confronting them. I had imagined finally speaking the truth. But imagining it was nothing like living it. I could still feel the tension in the room, the weight of 5 years of silence pressing between us like something alive. And now that it had exploded, I didn't know what came next. For a long time, I didn't start the car. I just breathed. When I finally pulled away from the house, the road ahead was dark but strangely clear. It was the first time I had driven away from that place without feeling like I was abandoning something important. This time, I was choosing myself. Back at the rental house, I sat on the sofa for a long time, staring at the blank wall across from me. My bag lay on the floor where I dropped it, papers still inside. I could have unpacked them, spread them out, examined every detail again. But I didn't. Not yet. My heart wasn't ready. Instead, I let the silence wrap around me. Not the silence of punishment, the kind my mother used like a weapon. This was different. This was a quiet I chose. A quiet that didn't ask anything of me. My phone buzzed. A message from Mason. "I'm sorry, for all of it. Can we talk tomorrow?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the words. There was something raw in them. Vulnerable, true. Then another buzz, this time a name I didn't expect. Aunt Valerie. "Are you somewhere safe? I didn't know any of that. Call me if you need anything." More texts followed from cousins, distant relatives, people who had watched the scene unfold like they were witnessing something sacred crumble. Their messages were filled with shock, confusion, apologies. But none of them mattered to me. The next morning I woke before the sun. I showered, made tea, and sat at the dining table with the documents spread in front of me. Medical forms, financial ledgers, trust papers, my grandmother's letter. They looked different in the daylight, sharper, realer, and impossibly heavy. I spent an hour sorting them into stacks: inheritance documents, forged signatures, financial transfers, medical inconsistencies. Each piece of paper felt like another betrayal, another splinter from a childhood that had already cut me enough. At 10 o'clock, I met with the lawyer my business mentor had recommended. His office smelled like old books and winter air. He was kind but meticulous, eyes scanning each document with slow, deliberate care. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious. "You have a case," he said. "A strong one." My stomach twisted. What kind of case? Inheritance fraud, document tampering, potential identity issues depending on what comes from further investigation, and financial misuse involving your grandmother's estate. His words hit me like a cold wave. Fraud, tampering, misuse, he continued gently. "I need to ask you something difficult. Do you want to pursue criminal charges, or would you prefer a civil resolution?" My breath hitched. Criminal charges, against my mother. Part of me wanted to nod immediately. After everything she'd done, after years of emotional manipulation, after erasing me from my own family, after stealing what was mine, I could have pressed charges. I could have dragged her into court, stripped away every mask she had ever worn. But another part of me, a quieter part, spoke louder. "I don't want revenge," I said softly. "I want truth and peace." The lawyer nodded. "Then I can send a formal notice. We'll demand restitution of your inheritance, transfer of the trust property, and a written admission of alteration. If they refuse, we escalate." I nodded slowly. "Send it." When I left his office, snow had begun falling, gentle, slow flakes drifting through the gray morning air. The world felt muted, like it was exhaling. That evening I met Mason at the frozen lake where we used to play as kids. He stood by the edge, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, face pale with cold. When he saw me, he exhaled shakily. "I messed up." I shook my head. "You were a kid." I still stayed quiet, he whispered. "I watched her tear you down. I watched her take things from you, and I did nothing." "You were surviving," I said. "The same way I was." He looked at me, eyes glistening. "I want to be better, if you'll let me." I nodded slowly. "We'll take it one step at a time." His relief was palpable. Later that night, another message arrived, this time a voicemail from my father. I listened with the phone pressed to my chest. "Elena, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I should have stopped her. I should have protected you. I failed you. If you need me to testify for the trust, I will." I sat on the couch with tears slipping down my cheeks. Tears not just for the wounds he admitted, but for the father he could have been if fear hadn't swallowed him whole. Near midnight, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. Her message was long and venomous. She accused me of exaggeration, betrayal, public humiliation, ingratitude. She said I had ruined Christmas, destroyed the family, and twisted everything. In the entire 3 paragraphs, not one apology appeared. I read it twice. Then I deleted it. I didn't respond. Silence, finally, was mine to give. The next morning, I sat at my laptop and opened the legal documents again. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and clicked send. The formal notice went out. Restitution, transfer of assets, written acknowledgement, or court. My decision felt like both an ending and a beginning. I realized then that closure wasn't something other people granted, it was something I had to decide for myself, and that decision didn't require my mother's permission. That night I found an old ornament tucked deep in my suitcase, a cheap silver star I had made in elementary school. My mother had always hated it, said it looked sloppy, said it made the tree unbalanced. I held it in my palm for a long time before walking outside and dropping it into a donation box. It wasn't much, but it felt like letting something go, something heavy, something sharp, something that had clung to me for years. Standing there in the cold, I looked up at the sky. It wasn't snowing anymore. It was just quiet. And for the first time in my life, the quiet didn't hurt. The days after Christmas felt strangely weightless, as if the world had shifted under my feet and was still searching for a new place to land. I woke each morning, expecting to feel anger or grief, or the old familiar ache of being unwanted. But instead, I felt something quieter, something steadier, something I wasn't used to. Peace. Not the kind someone gives you. The kind you choose. On the morning of December 27th, my lawyer called to confirm my parents had received the formal notice. My father's attorney responded within hours. He agreed to full cooperation, full restitution, and full transfer of my grandmother's trust assets. His letter included a formal acknowledgement of the changes made to the trust and his failure to protect my interests. I cried when I read it, not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first honest thing he had given me in years. My mother didn't respond directly. According to the lawyer, she sent a short message through my father's attorney, refusing responsibility and claiming miscommunication, but she still signed the papers. She didn't argue, she didn't deny, she didn't threaten, she just signed. It was a quiet admission of guilt from the loudest woman I had ever known. I didn't call her, I didn't write back, I didn't go near that house again. Closure didn't require confrontation, not anymore. Some doors closed simply by refusing to open them again. Instead, I poured myself into something that felt remarkably like healing. I went back to therapy. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally ready to understand the ways I had learned to survive. I talked about the years of erasure, the holidays spent alone, the voice I had carried inside me that echoed with my mother's criticisms. I learned how those wounds shaped me and how they shaped North Star guidance. I learned how to forgive myself for staying too quiet too long. Forgiveness for myself came easier than forgiveness for them. I didn't force it. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a soft, uneven path you learn to walk in your own time. A few days later, I met Mason again at a tiny cafe near the frozen lake. He ordered hot chocolate, the same drink he'd loved as a child. His hands still shook a little, but there was a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I meant what I said, he told me. I want to do better. I want to be your brother again, if you'll let me. I studied him quietly. He looked older, tired, worn by secrets he never should have carried. But he was trying. Really trying. And that mattered more than anything, he said the night of the confrontation. We go slow, I told him. We do this without her. He nodded immediately. Relief softened his whole face. That same evening when I got back to my rental, I found a letter taped to the door. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. My father. I read it standing in the cold hallway. He apologized. Not in the vague, careful way he used to apologize for my mother's behavior. This was raw and specific. He apologized for the silence, for the complicity, for letting her isolate me, for not protecting the trust, for not stepping between us when she weaponized her voice, and mine collapsed under the weight of her control. I can't change the past, he wrote, but I hope this truth helps you build your future. Inside the envelope was a photo me at age 3 sitting on my grandmother's lap. She was smiling at me in a way no one else in that house ever had. I pressed the photo to my chest and cried until the ache in my ribs softened into something gentler. I didn't respond to his letter. Maybe one day I would. Maybe not. Healing didn't demand immediate answers, it simply required honesty, and we had finally reached that point. North Star guidance grew in ways I hadn't expected. The Forbes article drew partnerships from therapists, mental health advocates, and wellness creators. Daniel and I expanded the app, adding daily reflection tools, boundary scripts, and community spaces for survivors of toxic family systems. I hired a small team: developers, writers, licensed therapists, people who believed healing should be accessible, affordable, and compassionate. My pain had become purpose. My story had become a roadmap. My silence had become a voice amplified enough to help others find theirs. The biggest change came the following Christmas. For the first time, I didn't dread the holiday. I didn't brace myself for a phone call that never came. I didn't wait for someone to remember me. Instead, I drove 2 hours north to a small cabin I'd rented in the woods. Snow covered the trees in thick white layers, and the sky glowed pale blue around the edges. Inside, I placed a small tree near the window and decorated it with ornaments. I chose myself wooden stars, hand-painted bulbs, a silver moon I bought from a craft market. Each piece felt like a step toward reclaiming something I had lost. I cooked myself a simple dinner, sat by the fire, and read the letter from my father once more. Then I unfolded my grandmother's note, the one I'd found in the attic, the one she wrote to me 20 years ago, but my mother never delivered. Her handwriting flowed in soft, careful lines. You are loved, she wrote. You are worthy. You are stronger than they know. I pressed the letter against my heart and whispered, I know. The next morning I walked to the frozen lake. The surface glimmered under the winter sunlight. I held a small stone in my gloved hand, smooth, warm from my pocket. I whispered a quiet goodbye to the girl I used to be, the one who cried alone on Christmas mornings, the one who believed silence meant unworthiness. Then I dropped the stone onto the ice. Letting go didn't feel dramatic. It felt simple, light, honest. Later that week, I sat at my desk writing a message for my audience about boundaries, healing, and rewriting the narrative of your own life. I told them that closing a chapter doesn't always require forgiveness, but it always requires courage. And when I finished, I closed my laptop and looked around my small rented home, realizing I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Real, steady hope. Not for my mother. Not for reconciliation that would never come. But for myself and the life I was finally choosing. Before I go, if you've ever lived through something like this, if you've ever faced a toxic parent or carried family secrets in silence or spent holidays feeling invisible, I hope my story reminded you that you're not alone. And if you want to stay with me for more stories, more journeys of healing justice and taking back your voice, I'd love to have you here. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you. And if you want to be here for the next one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your voice matters more than you know.